Chag Hashavua, Zman Matan Tereseinu. We know, of course, the minhag is that on Shavuos we learn Megillas Rus. We give learn Megillas Rus, which tells of how Rus and Orpah, the two daughter-in-laws of Naomi, accompanied her back to Eretz Yisrael after the great tragedy where their husbands were wiped out and they traveled poor and penniless, and they both intended to accompany Naomi. But at the end of the day, it was only Rus that persevered and Orpah left. And one would think that Rus, of course, was the tzaddikus. Rus, of course, was the mother of the Malchus of Klal Yisrael. David HaMelech descended from Rus. But one would think that Orpah is certainly very praiseworthy. She made a valiant attempt, a noble attempt, to accompany Naomi on this journey of Mesiras Nefesh. And in fact, Chazal say that her intention was very noble at the time. She said that, and Rus said, both of them said that no, we will cleave to you. We will go with you. Ki itech nashuv la'amech. We will go and return to you. And the Ramvali, the Talmud of Ramchal, says is that they had an intention, and Orpah as well. Her intention was l'shem shamayim. She wanted to be dovek to Naomi. She wanted to be dovek in the das of Naomi. Her intention was l'shem shamayim. This past year, we suffered a great loss in Klal Yisrael. One of the many, unfortunately, the loss of the great Pesach in America, the great Gadol Rabbi Dovid Feinstein Zatzal. And he commented on the pasuk of Atetzim min hamokum asher hoysa sham ushtei kaloseha ima. It says ushtei kaloseha ima, that Naomi went from the place, her dwelling place, she went back to Eretz Yisrael, and it says ushtei kaloseha ima. She had her two kalas with her, two daughter-in-laws. The pasuk says shtei. We know there were two. Why does it emphasize shtei, that there were two? He says Rav Dovid Zatzal, to indicate that at that point in time they were equal. Just like we find that on Yom Kippur there was the two Seirim, the two Sim Echel Hashem, V'Echel Azazel, and the Gemara darshans that the Shnei Seirim were Shovais. They had to be the same. They had to be the same quality, they had to be the same, the two of them had to be equal. Similarly, he says, the emphasis over here on Shtei Kaloiseh, which seems to be redundant, the Pasuk is emphasizing that at that point in time they were equal. At that point in time they were on the same madrega, they were equal. That being the case, it's a pella. It's a dover pella. It's something that is just incredible. Because the Medrash, Rus Rabbah, darshans that when Orpah returned, Naomi said to Rus, that she went back, and she went back to her Avodah Zarah. As soon as she came in Sheshava, that immediately that night, she went back to her Avodah Zarah. She departed from Naomi. She was going to be Meiser Nefesh, to be part of Am Yisrael, and she couldn't withstand the test. She couldn't withstand the challenge. She turned back, and immediately, that night, she returned to her Avodah Zarah. And the Medrash darshans further that not only did she return to her Avodah Zarah, she did the most grotesque, disgusting actions that very same night. That very same night that she returned to Tumah and Znus and Avodah Zarah. Right away. What happened? How did she fall so fast and so hard? At one moment being ready to be Meiser Nefesh, to be Dovek in Nomi and Rebbeinu Shalom, and in an instant to turn around, turn back, and be Oived Avodah Zorah and to sink into the depths of Tumah. It's fascinating that the Gemara and Soita darshans on the Pasuk in Shmuel. The Pasuk in Shmuel says, "Is Arbas Elo Yuldu LaHarpa Begas." These are the 4 sons of Harpa Begas. Harpa Begas, that's what the Pasuk says. Vayiplu biyad Dovid biyad Avodav. And they fell into the hands of David HaMelech and his servants, and they killed them out. They annihilated them. So this was Harpa Begas. She had 4 giants. They fell into the hands of David HaMelech, who did battle with them, and he killed them. Who were these giants? And who was Harpa Begas? My Nihu Amar of Chisda, Safu Modern Goliath V'Yishbi. These were 4 children, 4 giants of Orpah, the very same Orpah, who turned her back on Naomi. And she gave birth to these 4 giants, one of them the famous Goliath. David HaMelech killed them all out. Not only did she turn her back on Naomi and went to be Oived Avodah Zorah and sunk into the depths of Tumah, but her and her children were filled with hatred and rage against Yidden, David HaMelech, the descendants of her counterpart, Ruth. And the Gemara in Saita recounts how Orpah herself wanted to kill David HaMelech when he was fleeing. It's incredible. Orpah and Ruth were together. They were in this together. Kindred souls, they were going to follow their mother-in-law to Eretz Yisrael, to the Rebbeinu Shalom. Ruth withstood the challenge, and Naomi did, and Orpah didn't. But not only did she not withstand the challenge, but then she turned her back totally and completely, filled with rage and hatred, and opposed everything that Naomi stood for, and was filled with hatred and rage against Ruth and her descendants. What happened? What was triggered here? And what can we learn out from this? And how does it apply to our lives? We find somewhat of a similar phenomenon right at the beginning of the Torah, in Parshas. Somewhat of a similar phenomenon. There were 2 brothers in the whole world. In the whole entire world, there were 2 brothers. You would think that they would love each other in the utmost, the epitome of brotherly love. Cain and Hevel. Only 2 brothers to share this whole world. And what happened? Cain killed Hevel. He killed him. He killed his brother. The only other person, aside from his parents, the only other person, the only other man that was there in the world, aside from his father. And why did he kill him? For jealousy. Ad kedei kach. Zok the Ramban. Cain was the Bechor. He was the older one. Cain was the one that was considered to be the superior one. When Cain's korban was rejected, and Hevel, who was considered the inferior one, the secondary one, his korban was accepted, Cain was filled with rage and jealousy. And this teaches us an important nekuda. If a person sees someone that he considers as equal, and certainly if he sees someone he considers to be less than him, if there is a challenge, if there's a test, and if the one who's inferior succeeds, the one who considers himself to be an equal or certainly superior fails, the one that succeeds is a living testament to the failure of this person. And if it's an important challenge and an important test, and he witnesses and he sees and observes in front of him and he sees this person who succeeded where he failed, where he wanted to succeed, and he failed, and this person who he considers to be his subordinate succeeded, that's a living testament to his failure, and he cannot tolerate that. So Cain killed Hevel. We find another similar example by Kairach. Kairach was from the greatest of the Yidden in the Dor HaMidbar. He was from the greatest. He was from the Neisei HaOren. He was considered to be on the level of Aaron and Cain. And he was one of the wealthiest. He had part of that treasure of Mitzrayim. But he did not pass the test. Aaron and Cain was chosen. Aaron was chosen to be the Cain Gadol and not Kairach. Even though Kairach had all the attributes, he had all the milas, all the kishroinas, all the qualities, he was considered to be one of the greatest, if not the greatest. He had all of those attributes, but he was not chosen. He failed. And Aaron, who he considered to be his lesser, inferior to him, he's the one that succeeded. He passed the test. And that was too much for Kairach. And not only did he rise up against Moshe Rabbeinu and Aaron HaKohen, but he rose up and he went against, and he rebelled against everything that they stood for. Chazal say that Kairach apikairis hoya. Kairach was an apikair, he became an apikairis. It was too much for him. This failure, this great person with all the kaichas, all the talents, all the kishroinas, who was everything, had everything. Moshe and Aaron was a living testament. Moshe and Aaron, they were edus to his failure. He rose against them, rebelled against them, and everything that they stood for. He apikairis hoya, and he caused the machlokes and got everyone to rebel against Moshe v'Torasai. That is a lesson that we learn from this Maisa with Orpah. Ruth was a living example, living edus to her failure. And she was so filled with rage against Ruth, Naomi, who were living testaments of her failure, her downfall, filled with such rage that she rebelled not only against the Rebbeinu Shalom, against all that it stood for, all the Torah stood for, all the principles of the Torah, but filled with rage against Naomi and Ruth and her descent, her children, wanted to annihilate Klal Yisrael, David HaMelech and Klal Yisrael. Great people, sometimes great people, cannot tolerate failure. Sometimes the greater the person, the greater they are, and the Yetzer is greater, the Yetzer Hara is greater. They cannot tolerate failure. And someone who they consider to be less than them, or even equal to them, but certainly less than them, who has succeeded, where they did not, where they wanted to, and they did not, they cannot tolerate that, and they are filled with jealousy and rage, hatred. And so Orpah rebelled against the Torah, the Rebbeinu Shalom, and is filled with hatred against Ruth and Klal Yisrael. And that is an unfortunate lesson that repeated itself throughout the course of our history. And that, unfortunately, from time to time, too many times, people that were in our midst, people that were part of our camp, people that were close to us when they fell, and not only they fell, but they rebelled. And they were filled with hatred and became our enemies. We saw this during the Churban. We saw this during the period after the Churban. And in the Middle Ages, we saw it during the period of the Inquisition, how many Yidden who could not stand up to the challenge, and they themselves turned against us and became part of the Inquisition, and were roidif and mastered and were roidif of us. How many times through our history and through the time of the Haskalah, it's well documented that the tragedy of the closing of the yeshiva in Volozhin, that great tragedy in Klal Yisrael where they closed the yeshiva in Volozhin, that the instigators of the slander against the great Netziv, the instigators of the slander against the yeshiva and the Torah, were none other than Yidden, who they themselves broke away from Torah observance, and their children, and they witnessed their children intermarry. And they were filled with hatred against the Torah. It was a living example of their failure. And they turned against the Torah, they turned against us. And look what they caused. And we've seen it in our days as well. Anti-Semitism. The modern term of anti-Semitism, anti-Haredism. And so many times they were from people instigated, brought about from people from our midst who had fallen, who did not stand up to the challenge, and then became our bitter enemies. And it's a lesson to learn. The Torah, Shavuot, is a zman of matan Torah seinu. As we know, Chazal tell us that when the Torah yard l'olam, and we got the Torah, then sinna, the sin of the umas yard l'olam. Then there was sinna because they did not stand up to the challenge. They could have accepted the Torah. It was offered to them, but they did not pass the test. But sometimes this sinna, Rahman al-Islam, comes even more from people in our midst. And we have to be careful, we have to be careful and protect our Torah, and protect our children and our families, and protect our Torah and protect it within us. Be careful from those outside, but be careful from those who fall. And try to ensure that they don't fall. But if Rahman al-Islam they do, we should not assume that just because they grew up with Torah, that just because they grew up seeing the Torah, tasting the Torah, that they will be the friends of Klal Yisrael. And Oivei Torah sometimes is quite the contrary. And sometimes when we think that people, just because they had a background in Torah, are Oivei Torah, it's quite the opposite. And we have to protect Klal Yisrael and Torah from all those who Rahman al-Islam come up against us.